Were you also expecting China's imminent collapse as forecasted by Western experts for the past couple of decades? In today's conversation, Professor Roberts engages in a discussion in which the Chinese model is scrutinized, highlighting the reasons for its persistent economic success, whilst at the same time highlighting the contradictions and challenges for the Chinese transitions economy. In particular, critiques based on arguments such as lack of internal demand and the supposed Japanification of China are addressed and debunked.
So we're here again with Professor Roberts. We want to talk about a recent article that he published on his blog, The Next Recession. And the topic of today's discussion is going to be China. So to kickstart our conversation, so I just read your article, Michael, and well, in the West, it is at least a decade that we hear commentators talking about an imminent collapse of China. And yet the recent data on GDP growth for 2024 talk about a 5% increase as opposed to the 2.8% of the US. And well, in Europe, we are probably lagging at 0 point something. So my first question would be, is this another year in which the announced collapse will be postponed to the next? And jokes aside, if you could give us a brief introduction on about your article and about these two sessions that have just occurred in Beijing, I guess.
Yes, that's right. Yes, it's a continue. Well, I always smile when I have to read in the Western media, but in the financial media, that China is in imminent collapse. As you pointed out, the imminent collapse prophecy has been bandied around for the last 20 years, and in particular in the last 10 years, that China is heading for disaster. All we could say, first of all, is that if any economies are heading downwards, it's been the major economies in the West in the last 10 to 15 years who have really suffered. As you pointed out, the growth rate for the US, which is the best performing economy in the West of the major economies, last year posted 2.8% rise in national output, which a modest increase. But when you, as you say, in Europe, most of the countries are lucky to get 1%. In the case of Germany, it was actually negative. Germany's in a slump. The major economy of Europe is in a slump. And yet we're told that China is in serious trouble and about to collapse. And yet they've recorded, and it's been accepted by the official agencies in the West, that they recorded a 5% growth rate in their national output in 2024. And if you look at the average over the last, even the last 10 years, they've been averaging 5 to 7% a year growth rate. And given the size of the economy, you can see how quickly that means they are catching up with the large economies in the West. And if you measure it in terms of what they call purchasing parity, which is say how much is the output that a country's got, how much they can spend at home to get the resources that they can produce from that. And as you show on the graph here, you can see on that measure, which is the left-hand measure, China now, as a total economy, is larger than the US by some distance and has been for several years. If you want to look at it on the international dollar scale, which means measuring each country basically on international trade and transactions across the world in dollar terms, then they're still behind the US, but you can see the gap is closing quite quickly, and probably why even Mark Rubio, the Secretary of State under the Trump administration, says that China will surpass the United States within the next 5 or 10 years, probably 5 years, given current rates. So even though China has slowed down in growth rate from the double digits that it had in the 2000s to 6 to 7% in the middle of the 2010s now to something like 5% a year, that is still nearly twice as fast as the United States. And the United States, the OECD just announced today that the United States is going to slow down quite sharply next year to only just above 2%, while the European economies remain 1% or below. And yet they're still forecasting China to continue to grow at around 4.5% to 5% over the next few years. So the gap will continue to close. And we can see the way in which the Chinese economy has gone is absolutely dramatic. Anybody who visits China to see the incredible development of the infrastructure, railways, bridges, roads, big cities, not just that, but also in the important technological areas like electric vehicles, batteries, all sorts of technical developments. And of course, as we know very recently, in artificial intelligence models, where they have jumped forward to catch up with the big American companies that claim to have a lead in that position. So this is a phenomenal process which China has been engaged in over the last 40 to 50 years, with tremendous success from deep poverty up to a level where it's catching up with the United States, not yet in per person, because that's still some way behind, but in overall output and in terms of closing the gap in terms of people's conditions. Something like 900 million Chinese who were at poverty levels just 40 years ago are now removed from what the World Bank considers as a poverty level. So that's a dramatic, and no other country has ever achieved that in that period of time. And given the size of China, the largest populated economies in the world, and therefore a huge number of people being removed from degrading levels of poverty over the last 40 years. So when the Chinese Parliament met, they call it the National People's Congress, last week or so, they had two sessions, one where they have a consultative assembly and then the Parliament itself, and they were presented with the economic results of the last 5 years and what's going to happen this year and beyond. And generally, we can see that that's the result of that process. Nothing's been perfect, which perhaps we can discuss later and why. But clearly, China has made a dramatic progress, and there's no sign that they're heading into some sort of crash in any way. If anything, the problems that exist for the Western economies are ones that could worsen over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was actually thinking that when you were comparing the GDP in international dollars rather than in PPP, that at a time where China is increasingly trading in its own currency, I guess that the very measure of international dollars loses a bit of its weight, because historically, I think PPP is important to compare the relative size of the economy as its capacity to have, real production within the country in a way. And then the international dollars is important in case you have to import stuff from outside. But if you're now purchasing raw materials from, say, Saudi Arabia, and you pay in renminbi, then the meaning of that persistent gap in international dollars is not as important, and it's also largely the result of the devaluation of the yuan. So
we also have to be realistic. I would tell the viewers that if China's economy is the same size as the US in terms of total output, that still means that output per person is much, much lower in China, because they have 1.4 billion people and the US has 350 million, way smaller. So China's output per person is around about 30% of the US. So it still means that the average living standards, assuming that there's no inequalities, which of course there are in both countries, average living standards are still lower in China. But the difference, when we're talking about average living standards, we're talking about people's wages and what they can spend it on. We're not talking about the social wage, with a huge amount of development of the roads, rails, bridges, as I talked about before, that you have in China, which dramatically improves people's well-being and their ability to use their time and effort in work and in leisure, which doesn't exist. I mean, the US has not built a new railway line for decades and decades. It has no railway system really worth talking about. And that's an indication of where the West spends a lot of time talking about how personal consumption is better. We can buy all kinds of different sorts of ice creams in the United States We can't buy them in China, which isn't true, by the way. You can buy just any number of ice creams in China too. But that sort of argument doesn't really present a good case for saying things are improving compared to what buying the basic transport, infrastructure, health and education services, which China is continually improving year by year.
I mean, even a basic statistic such as the expected age, expected living age, not wage, but age, is increasing in China, and I think recently has been decreasing in the US. So
yes, that's right. Life expectancy at birth, US after COVID saw a significant drop in life expectancy at birth, below all the European countries, down to about 78, 79 years. That's on the average. Somebody who's born will live till 78 or 79 in the US. It was a bit higher. It's fallen. In the case of China, it was a few years ago just 73, and now it's nearly 76, 77. So virtually no difference now in China for somebody who is born. Their average life expectancy is much the same as it is in the US. As that sort of human development is the key factor in anybody's life, literally.
Yeah. So to go back to your article, I wanted to ask you a second question, which is about the Western narrative of a Chinese economy heading for stagnation, as it's supposedly based on excessively export-oriented growth. And I guess that they then add the argument that with tariffs that will, spoil it even more. And so the accusation is to be an economy that hasn't got enough internal consumer demand. And I wanted to ask you if there was evidence for this, or if maybe a export-oriented model was indeed a characteristic of China's economy, possibly just in the immediate afterwards of the entry in WTO, and whereas instead in recent years, the relevance of internal consumption has actually increased. So I was wondering if you could talk us a little bit about the average consumption patterns in China as opposed to the Western countries, and possibly data on real wages and the real GDP growth.
Well, the first thing I would say is that economic growth generally is driven by the ability to invest in new products, new technology, and in the labor force, improving its skills and so on. So economic growth is driven first and foremost by investment, not by consumption. Consumption uses up growth. It doesn't create more growth. It doesn't take the economy forward. It's the reward you get for increasing output and then redistribute it in terms of the things that you need to consume, whether they're in public services and so on, or whether they're in individual consumption. So the idea that you have to have more consumption in order to get an economy going forward, which is a sort of bastardized version of the theories of John Maynard Keynes under consumption theory, is not actually an explanation of how growth really is achieved. And the development of the major economies develop when they have higher levels of investment in new technology, in the labor force, which takes the economy forward. And when the economy goes forward, more people get jobs, then you get incomes rise and people spend more money, so they consume more. So it's investment leads consumption. And you can see that that's the situation we've had, at least in my view, in China, that you've had a very high investment rate, much higher than any other country in the world. Something like 40 to 45% of annual output is reinvested, not necessarily productively always, but it's reinvested. But that produces a growth rate which allows consumption to grow. Now, the Western economists say, well, look at the consumption to GDP. They say, look at the US or in the European countries, consumption to GDP, that's personal consumption, is about 65 to 70% of output. And that's what makes the economy work, while in China, it's 45 or 50% at best. And that's why China's in trouble, because there's no demand for all this goods that they're investing in producing in the state industries. So they have to export it because they can't sell it at home. Well, this is just not true. If you look at the position of consumption in China, actually the vast majority of things produced in China are sold in their own market, not abroad. The export ratio is high, but it's not decisively high compared to the huge amount of sales that are made domestically to Chinese households and also to other Chinese businesses. So first of all, it's not true that consumption is so low that it's impossible, they're forced to export. That's not the case. They can export, and because they can compete so well on price, they're able to take a bigger share of the world markets as a result. And if we look at consumer growth, wage growth has been rising very fast as a result of growth in the economy, and so has spending by households. So that I looked at the figures since the end of the pandemic to now, and if you want to go even back further to the end of the Great Recession in 2009, and you'll see that the average growth in consumption in China has been faster than any other country. And I see you have the screen up there, which shows you exactly that you can see that China's annual private consumption growth is way higher than the US, the OECD, the Eurozone, the UK, and so on. Yes, it's come down, but so the other countries' consumption growth rates also fallen. So that means that people are benefiting from this growth rate, and that's improving their levels of consumption. And this is personal consumption. It's not social consumption. Often left out of the figure is things like spending on health, spending on pensions, spending on education, spending on transport. All those things are very important, public services of that nature, of what we consume socially rather than just personally. And they can make a big difference to our living standards as well. And when we look at those areas in the West, they're not so wonderful at all. And that is the point I was making earlier. So I think the argument that China is forced to export and it's in danger of collapsing because there is no demand at home is not really a winnable argument as far as I'm concerned. Now, it is true that Chinese leaders are concerned about this issue. And the reason they've been concerned about the issue is because the housing market, the huge real estate property market, which rocketed up in the early 2000s and into the 2010s, collapsed towards the end of the 2010s in a big property bubble bursting. A lot of private developers in housing, which is very important in China for people from moving rural areas to urban areas. It's the big thing, was organized not by the state, but by private developers who borrowed money from banks, not just banks in China, but also abroad, built up a lot of debt. And when the housing market began to sink, they started to go bust. So there's been a bit of a bust in the property market. In my view, a mistake by the Chinese leaders to rely upon the private sector to deliver housing and construction. We only know too well in Italy, in Spain, in Ireland, in Portugal, in other places around Spain during the 2010s, what that housing bust meant for people. So to go in the private sector is a mistake by the Chinese leaders. Now they have had to reverse that. Their investment now is going much more in the direction of technology rather than property, but it has left a significant dent, higher debt, and a dent in the level of consumer confidence in many areas. So they did announce yesterday a new program for trying to boost consumer demand, which I think in the areas which they said, which seemed quite important to me, more money for child benefit for parents having more children, more money for pensions, raising the minimum wage, all those areas, and other public subsidies to boost people's spending power seem reasonable to me. But I finish on this point. That is not going to save China, and it's not necessary to save China, because as long as the investment growth is continuing, the output is developing, and productivity remains high, then China continue to grow despite the question of whether consumer demand is too low. This Western argument, in my view, is nonsense.
No, I think it's a very, I mean, if you have read even one page of Marx, this should resonate with you, but even the neoclassics, I mean, they're all about productivity up until somebody is more productive than than then. So no, I wanted to ask you more about this sort of like accusation of stagnant economy, because there's also been parallelism with Japan. So because in the 1980s, Japan was a up and coming economy, and then it did go through a massive house bubble as well in the late 80s, and then when the bubble burst, they have had decades of stagnating economy. But I think that at least at 99 Media or Ottolina TV for our Italian public, we do believe that economics and politics are intimately intertwined. So that narrative about what happened to Japan might not be the whole story. And so tackling the Japan-China comparison from a slightly wider perspective, would you agree in an analysis that says that modern China and 1980s Japan are indeed significantly different in the nature of their state and their historical heritage? And just to clarify, would you agree with the view that saw Japan as something of, let's say, maybe you want to use the word vassal of the US, both objectively and ideologically? I mean, I don't think you could claim that Japan has had full sovereignty since the end of World War II. So which this issue has ultimately forced them into a subordinate role, which was officialized via the Plaza Louvre Accord, and which forced a revaluation of the yen and made Japanese companies less competitive. So hasn't China shown that it is not willing to go down a similar path?
I think that's right. I mean, we have a phrase which is, for those who want to say that China is going to stagnate or collapse, Japanification is what they call it. So that China is heading towards the way Japan is. What do they mean by this? They say, well, first of all, China's population now is beginning to decline. Their workforce is beginning to decline, just as it has in Japan. Japan's had a falling population for some time and a falling workforce, and therefore it's heading to a similar direction of stagnation like Japan. Also, it's built up a huge amount of debt in China. So Chinese corporations have a lot of debt, and that this is similar to Japanese corporations, and particularly the Japanese government has the highest debt to GDP amongst the major economies in the world, and that's weighing down on the ability of Japan to grow. These are the arguments presented to say that China is on the way to ending up like Japan. Well, one or two things strike me as being somewhat different. Well, you've mentioned one. First of all, China has never been occupied by the United States. It's never been, the industry of China is not in the hands of US or Western capitalist companies. They're all there, but they don't control the economy. The economy is broadly and strongly in the hands of the state and the state machine through its state enterprises. So it's able to combat any sort of decline in the private sector if it gets into crisis or stagnation. That doesn't have, China can compensate for that. Japan cannot do that. And in addition to that, Japan's profitability of capital has dramatically fallen, as you say, partly because they've been forced to accept a stronger yen than they could require to maintain their economy, but also they've not been able to invest productively in the last 20 years, unlike China. And so because of that, their productivity growth rate is abysmal. As you can see in the graph here, it's well down. A green dot column is the Japanese productivity rate over the last 30 or 40 years compared to the red one in China. So if that's Japanification, then there's still some way to go before China reaches that point. And just one simple point. Japan is a largely populated society, I think about 120 million, but it's nothing compared to 1.4 billion that the Chinese country is composed of. This is a dramatic difference. The idea that 1.4 billion economy is growing at 4 to 5% a year with productivity growth rates something similar, that it cannot sustain that and will end up like Japan, doesn't seem to bear any truth in the matter. Yes, population is declining a little. That means that productivity becomes even more important. To explain to viewers, if your output depends on how many people are working, then The more people you get working, the more output you get. But if less people are working, and more people are getting old and not working, then you need to increase the productivity of the workers you do have. And that depends on the technology that they can use and their skills and so on. So then the emphasis must be on increasing the productivity of labour in order to compensate for a smaller workforce over a period of time, say the next 10 to 20 years. All the evidence shows that China is capable of achieving that. Other people and myself have calculated that they need a productivity growth rate of around 4 or 5%. That means they need to increase the output per worker who's working about 4 or 5% a year. If they do that, then they can sustain their targets that they're proposing over the next 5 years and so on quite easily, and maintain a growth rate which is nowhere near being called a stagnant economy, which Japan has not been able to achieve, as we can see from those productivity figures that you've got on the screen there.
Too much quantitative easing and too little investment in real productive.
Lots of money created, but not much production.
So you also mentioned now the word plan, and I guess that just to come to our conclusion, I will carry on for hours, but I guess that we want to keep it short and to the point. So I wanted to ask you one last question. So how much do you think that economic planning of the state is at the basis of ultimately this Chinese economic success? And if you think that the Chinese leadership has had a shift since the beginning of the Xi era in reclaiming the role of the state after maybe a phase where market-led reforms might have gone too far. And in another article, you pointed out at the presence of a relatively large sector of the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, and how those have been instrumental in allowing the government to absorb economic shocks. So going back to the point of before, where Westerners are sort of like emphasizing the need to incentivize consumption and to allow dividends ultimately from enterprises to go in the pockets of the shareholders to boost consumption, do you not see this as a Trojan horse argument that really is suggesting that, again, what needs to be done is to privatize SOEs, make it China, Western, and that's the solution? And do you not think instead that the direction should be rather the opposite, and maybe focusing on real, let's say, Marxist or socialist reforms that might go towards the measures that you were quoting before? So rising minimum wage, maybe liberalization of union activities. I know it's hard because for the state, it needs to keep the control, but that should really be the direction of the evolution of a socialist, even though with Chinese characteristic.
I think that's right. I mean, why has China's economy been so successful? In my view, it's because it's been able to avoid the booms and slumps of capitalism, where capitalism has regular slumps or recessions, as we economists sometimes call them, or a drop in their output and investment and so on. People lose their jobs for maybe 6 months, 12 months or longer. These are severe slumps. We've had one nearly every 7 to 8 years in the Western economies. If you look back since 1980 now to 2025, we've had lots of world slumps. 1981, 1991, a small one in 2001, a huge one in 2008, an even larger one in the pandemic slump of 2020, if rather short. In all those, China has not had a reduction in output or investment or employment. It has not joined the rest of the major economies in a slump. Why is that? Because the state sector is so large, and the planning mechanism behind that, provided by the government, enables them to compensate and absorb any decline which takes place in their still quite large capitalist sector. And they did have declines in those slumps in the capitalist sector, but they were overcome by state investment and state planning. And so that situation was avoided. China was able to continue growth throughout that period, even though the world economy was going downwards, and world trade also went downwards, China managed to avoid that. So the strength of the state sector in China is a key factor for us to understand economically. No other major economy has got that level of state investment and control in the banks, the big industries, and so on. That doesn't mean to say the government doesn't allow developments of the private sector. It has done to a great extent, in my view, too much now, because I think now China is such a more powerfully developed economy technologically that it doesn't need Western capital, it doesn't need foreign investment, it doesn't need foreign technology even more now. It's an ability to be able to do this on its own to some extent. And so it increasingly, in my view, could move to a more planned basis with state investment. And we're beginning to see that. And when things go wrong in China, and they have done, it's the private sector that's usually caused the problem. There are billionaires in China. There is high inequality of income and wealth in China. Not as high as in the West, but it's high. And that's because they have a big capitalist sector with a lot of money being made by a lot of Chinese owners and foreigners, but mainly Chinese owners, who also have quite a close relationship with the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. So it's difficult to break that connection. And so that produces a significant, how can I put it, division within the Communist Party leadership. It varies. There's a zigzag. There's times when the Communist Party leaders have opened up the private sector, thought about privatizing sections of the state sector. Then they've swung back. Under the present leadership, they seem to be against privatizations, and on the contrary, want to maintain the state sector's role in the economy. But these decisions are being made by a small elite at the top of the Communist Party in China. Working people in China do not have a say. They cannot take their leaders to account on any mistakes or errors that they make in the direction of the economy. And that is a real danger, fault that lies ahead for China. It's not so much that it can't base itself on a state-invested economy with planning. The danger is that its leadership is not accountable. There's no real democratic control over the leadership, and that leads to errors and disasters, both nationally and internationally. So that's the real challenge for China ahead. How is it going to deal with Trump's policies of trying to squeeze China to death with tariffs, technology bans, and other sanctions down the road? How will the Chinese leadership handle that? Is it going to involve the working people of China in defending what China has gained over the last 40 years? Or is it continue to just keep it in its own hands and resist any dissent?
Well, yes, that opens up to broader questions that maybe we can save for another time. But also there was another thing that maybe next time we could touch upon, which is I think that there's another contradiction, which is the role of the yuan. Like, on one hand, it seems to be that in order to compete with the US financially, there's a tendency to allow some level of internationalization of the yuan, also to attract foreign capitals and in a way to compete with the US also financially. But that, as thinking dialectically, will create a contradiction, because then you expose yourself to more and more vulnerability. So I guess that the point is really what the,
I would add to that, no economy, no country can achieve harmonious development towards a better world, a socialist world, if you like, on its own. It's going to require the international cooperation of all the major economies in the world in the direction of achieving that, to improve the conditions for the world, end poverty around the world, avoid wars, and so on. No one country can do it. But that means also that if there's a view amongst some people in China that they can internationalize their currency in order to, as it were, usurp the position of the dollar, I think that would be a big mistake, because China needs to protect its economy. It therefore needs controls over the movement of capital in and out of the country by its capitalist sector. And it's not strong enough to achieve an international cooperation movement that goes beyond the dollar towards a world organization of trade and investment. No one country is yet. We need the cooperative forces of working people to achieve that over the next generation.
I guess we're back to the historical question, the difficulty of being the only socialist country in the world.
And because China is just about the only largest, if you want to call it socialist country, it's full of contradictions and things which we would consider as socialists not being socialists. So it is a curate's egg. I know that's an English phrase, an egg with spots on it or things wrong with it that don't make it. It's not a perfect socialism. I wasn't that position.
I wasn't suggesting that, but yeah, I guess that the problem is
socialist can be lived. Yeah. It's certainly different from the other countries.
What I was trying to say is that assuming that the intention is to go towards socialism, it's hard to achieve that in a world where you're clearly the odd one out,
yes,
and other powers are doing their best to sort of like.
The difference is that at least China is not Cuba. At least China is not a tiny little place next to the United States, boycotted and destroyed for over 70 years. China is a huge economy, which is what frightens United States and the imperialist powers of Europe, that they now face a massive resistant economic and political force, which doesn't act as a vassal like Japan, or for that matter, Britain. That it's now a force of its own, and that's the frightening thing for Western imperialism as we go into the rest of this decade.
All right, thank you very much, Michael. It would be nice, now you mentioned the word imperialism, to talk about why you also think that China is not imperialist, but I think that would really lead us into too long.
Yes, another discussion, yes.
It's another discussion for another time.
So, to sum up, it seems that China's transitions economy is doing much better than what transpires from Western press. And even though not free from contradictions and challenges for the future, it seems that the socialist leadership is progressively adopting economic policies that would strengthen the socialist character of the Chinese state. Tune in for our next episode of this series of interview with Professor Michael Roberts here on 99 Media. And please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to help us spread through the algorithm. You may also want to support our work by donating via PayPal or GoFundMe at the links in the description below. I'm Diego, and this is 99 Media. We are an Italian-based collective of journalists, activists, philosophers, and artists whose goal is to build a media for the 99%. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.